This last part is your opportunity to come to this microphone with your own questions for these four gentlemen. I have a couple of my own, but please do not be shy about coming up, because this is a chance. Now, we are a little bit behind schedule, but we have about 15 minutes, if I understand, my watch is right. So the first question, none of you directly address the costs in dollars and in time. And I mentioned Florida, where some teachers tell me they spend 1/6 of their time either getting ready for what's called the FCAT or giving it, and so on and so forth. And that first time is money. Could you, and you can do it in any order, you do not all have to speak up, but could you address that question of time and money on these performance assessments? Shale, you got a microphone in your hand.
Sure. So the interesting thing that's happened with Race to the Top is that states are aggregated into these consortia to build assessments, which does change the cost structure very dramatically in terms of the development side of it. It means that it's actually possible to invest a large amount of money and get a really good test, which is a big shift. It doesn't change the fact that you still have to grade the test. And that is costly in either time or money. Either it needs to be built into the schedule of teachers as part of their regular year.
Because the teachers do the assessment. The
yeah,
teachers evaluate it.
Yeah, I mean, you could outsource it, but that would be even more expensive. So the goal would be to figure out a way to integrate this into the time that teachers are already grading student work. If the type of assignments that are being given in these assessments, these types of more authentic written work that actually looks a lot like what good teachers do every day in the classroom and are grading anyway, that's going to give them the kind of feedback that they want, and can become part of the practice, and doesn't necessarily have to be viewed as new work. It can substitute for existing work. We spend a lot of time in districts doing some form of benchmark testing or formative assessment on which much more money and time is spent than on the actual summative assessment work. And this can be a substitute for that as opposed to an additive.
Yeah, Ray?
What I would add is this. I think many times when the cost question comes up, it gets narrowly focused on the actual cost of assessment or the dollars associated per pupil, based on what you could afford, whether it's from $10 to $20 or more. And what we forget, if we're creating an assessment system of assessments that is focusing on not only supports for curriculum, but instruction and assessment, it's another way of looking at the cost structure as a way of looking at the cost benefits of those assessments, because many districts are making huge investments, beyond just the assessment and the test prep that goes along with that, but in the instruction and the other materials that are necessary to support a much more powerful curriculum. In fact, if I was going to just put one shout out on this, is that I know that Linda is actually doing a paper in this regard that looks at assessment more broadly and the cost structure associated with it.
But the way it works now is the state spends some money to buy a test, right, and the teachers do not spend their time grading that test. But right, in this system, the teachers are going to invest their time after the assessment is given with that evaluation process. I just want to make sure
yes,
I understand.
Well, that's the way that's the way I believe many of the panel is envisioning it. The teachers are not only engaged in the scoring and the evaluating, but also in the building of support materials, the instructional modules that support the activities, as well as the professional development necessary to build their capacity to do this work.
Will any of you argue that this makes teaching a better job, a more interesting job? I'm curious. Bob?
Well, the short clip, I'm so glad I showed it, of Tiana and the teacher that Stephanie, you told her that she passed. If you were to ask Stephanie about this work, she'd say this was getting Tiana to pass that portfolio in her senior year was the hardest job that she's ever had as a teacher. And it was the best work she's ever done as a teacher. And so our teachers, when we showed them the Common Core standards, I think there was a standing ovation that came out because they were saying, this is the work that we've already been doing, and now it's moving this way. So to see teachers really deeply engaged in performance assessment.
But more difficult. Shale, how are teachers in New York City responding?
I've been really pleasantly surprised. The teachers are tired of focusing on bubble tests, and they want something meaningful and real that connects to what they know kids need to learn. And when you give them an opportunity to focus deeply on that, they are willing to spend their time on it, and they are eager to engage. And it's not going to be easy either. It will take harder work. It will take learning new things, and people will get frustrated along the way. But it's the right work, and it's the work that people want to do.
Let me ask a general question about the barriers to making this happen. And by way of context, I had dinner last night with a friend in Palo Alto who has 2 kids at Palo Alto High School, which is arguably one of the better high schools in the country. And Palo Alto is a very wealthy community. One of his daughter has 40 students in her math class in Palo Alto, and 38 students in a science class. Is that I mean, that has to be a huge barrier when you're talking about wealthy communities with that many kids in a class, or not? Or is it, can you turn that into an opportunity?
I mean, it's shocking coming from New York to California, where the per capita is about half of what's spent on most of the East Coast here. So I don't have a good answer for how you manage 40 kids in your class. I can tell you that what we know about secondary school is it's less about an individual class size and more about the teacher load, meaning how many courses is the teacher teaching, and when you add up all the kids in those classes, how many kids do they have to think about, give feedback to, and individualize instruction for. And if you can structure your schedule, which is possible, where teachers are teaching a load of 80 ideally, or maybe 100 total, then you actually get to a level of academic rigor, which
people
means...
People in the know are laughing.
No, that's
and
hard, but I mean, even in a situation where the average class size is 40, if you structure extended periods that integrate topics like English and history, science, and math, teachers can teach 2 longer blocks and actually have 2 sections or 3 sections.
Well, but you also talked about the need to allow teachers have time to reflect. That doesn't happen in American schools. American teachers teach all the time.
I mean, that's not the case in all schools in America. I think that the common thread you see in the research is when teachers are involved in teacher teams and have regular time built in their schedule for that kind of professional learning, you see changes in student outcomes. And there are a lot of places in district and charter schools that have made that a priority.
Yeah. And John, let me just say that teacher time together is invaluable time. It's the most critical time. Right. And it's incumbent upon us to make that time as productive and as powerful as it can be. And I think some of the tools that Ray showed in his presentation and that Bob is testing in Envision Schools are designed to do just that, to use that time to get the instructional insight and the scaffolding they need to do the work they want to do in classrooms. So that is our collective responsibility to help them use that time as productively as possible.
You know, when I heard my friend Palo Alto talking about class size in California, 6 years ago, I produced a documentary about the history of California called First to Worst. I immediately began thinking there's a sequel, First to Burst. So the benefits here, we saw a little bit of the notion of benefits for students. Could you talk a little bit about that piece of it? It occurs to me that, you know, Linda talked about the 21st century. We're already well into it. Will we get there? On some level, schools are fundamentally obsolete in this terms of this regurgitation education. But how do students respond? And maybe, Bob, you, since you're on the ground as much as anyone.
Well, I think this work has to be completely about the students.
But how do students respond?
How the students respond, you know, it's a process. So we believe that you start with engagement. So performance tasks, inquiry-based, project-based learning working with them in the 9th grade begins to engage them in the work. Then we work towards the rigor and the mastery. When you see the students like Tiana, that's a great clip, but she's not the exception, she's the rule.
So, I asked, I remember following one of Ted Sizer's schools, a coalition of essential schools, a long time ago, and a huge challenge, this was a high school, was working with kids who had gone all the way up into 9th grade with a system which essentially was open ahead. And is that going to be a challenge? Then parents, of course, are used to open, pour the knowledge in. Do you have to address those
I think
issues?
you have to. That's one of the reasons why in Envision schools, we don't have middle schools. We start with 9th grade.
Yeah.
Because the majority of kids in high schools in this country start in 9th grade. And they start where our kids start, about 6th grade level in their skills, disengaged and distrustful of adults. It's possible, but it requires restructuring the time, but the assessments drive that. And I think that's what's missing, is when you have, you're going to change the way you design your school if you want different outcomes. So Poly will change the way that their school's designed if our assessments change, because they'll want their kids to do really well.
Other thoughts about the reactions of students, and the benefits for students?
Well, I think just a quick part, and I'll send it back to Shale, who's got his feet on the ground on this. But there's been repeated studies, and we have done a study as well of Envision. And these students are economically disadvantaged, but there's a 95% persistence rate in either a 2-year or 4-year college. They are still there after 2 to 3 years and successfully matriculating. And when they report back what they learned from the process, is they learned how to manage their time, how to be persistent around the task, how to find critical information, and they also learned how to both collaborate and produce high-quality work. Because in order to graduate from these performance-based programs that are competency-based, you have to be able as an individual student to demonstrate that you have developed a quality product that is indicative of being both college and career ready. So they're held to higher standards, and that process pays off for them, both in college and in life.
Quickly, because we're going to run out of time, let me ask you, each of you to, and you can agree with each other, but what are the 3 or 4 biggest barriers to widespread adoption? And that may entail identifying who actually benefits from a current system that most of us in this room think sucks. But what are that's a term we use in journalism. So there's a 2-part question, really, sort of who is benefiting, and what are the biggest barriers to having this go beyond pilot? What do you have to convince, for example?
Well, I'll put one on the table. In working with teachers in schools around in this area, the epiphany moment for me is that most of those teachers in that classroom grew up with No Child Left Behind. Right. They don't have muscle memory around other ways of teaching in preparation. So a huge barrier is not that the teachers aren't hungry and want to teach in this way, or that they're not capable of doing that, but a huge barrier is not that they haven't been prepared and supported to teach in a different way.